Hey everybody, it's Mr. Hefner, and today we are going to get started on our second literature unit in this American literature course. Today we're going to move into the American Revolution, and we're going to read literature that covers the time period from about 1750 until about 1800. So from the early signs that there's going to be an American Revolution up through the United States Constitution and the ratification of that. I'm here with none other than General George Washington himself, crossing the Delaware on that Christmas Eve to Trenton, New Jersey. But let's get started, and we'll move into the slides and we'll go from there. Okay, so here we go. We're starting the second unit, 1750 to 1800, focusing on literature that was related to the American Revolution. And our essential question for the entire unit is going to be very similar to all of our unit essential questions in this course as we move through historical time periods of American Lit. How are the ideas of the American Revolution reflected in the literature of the time period? So as we move through different time periods, we're going to look at those elements that sort of characterize that time period. That's why we've got a great meshing of history and literature in this course. Now, if we were in class, we would stop and I would ask you to brainstorm a list. You remember the KWL, what do you know to get started with, what do you want to know kind of thing. On a video, I'm not going to wait for you guys, but the question would be, what conditions of the time period facilitated the American Revolution? And this is going to be a really important question when it comes down to the literature that we're going to be reading. You see, revolutions of governments, it's not something that happened up until the American Revolution. There was this belief that monarchs were on the throne by divine providence. God wanted them there. God put them there. Their families had been on the thrones, generation after generation. And who's this common person to think that you could change that? And we're going to look at what really brought about these changes because it's a philosophical change. Everybody says, oh, it's taxation, excessive taxation or taxation without representation. But those things had existed for centuries. They certainly played a role, but there was something that changed in the thinking, in the philosophy of the people at that time. And we're going to take a look at that at this overview today, but we'll keep taking a look at it when we read things like the writings of John Adams and Jefferson and Patrick Henry and Benjamin Franklin as we move through this course. So, like all of our units, I've prepared for you a unit overview sheet. This is in Schoology. I would suggest, if you weren't in class, to get a handout. I would suggest that you print out your own copy. You can annotate it. You can actually write on it as we go through the course and then consider this to be part of your notes. Like all of the overview sheets, they're set up the same way. You have your unit essential question up at the top. That's going to be important because I promise you that will be the first essay question you see when we get to the unit test. I want you to be able to reflect back and tell me, why was the literature in this unit here and what does it have in common with all the other pieces that we looked at? You've also got the background knowledge. This is just a little bit about understanding the historical time period and what was going on at that time. That's what we're going to go through today. But you might also want to go into Schoology and read what I've scanned from the textbook. And then you have all of the literature that we're going to be reading in this unit. So in this section, you have the actual titles of the pieces. You have the lesson essential question that goes with each of those pieces. So in addition to the big unit essential question, we have a lesson essential question for each of the pieces that we're reading. You have an about the author, which is going to be important. We want to know about who these people were as much as what they wrote. And then you have the literary tools that we're going to focus on when we do each of the pieces, along with the definitions. And so I don't believe there's any need for you to look these things up in a dictionary and write out your own definition because I'm giving them to you right now. What's important to me is that you're going to be able to apply them in talking about these pieces. And then finally, at the very bottom, there is your one additional piece. And this is the piece that we're not going to read together, but I will give to you ahead of time. This is the piece that you're going to find on the unit test. So just as you have a unit essential question as your essay at the beginning of every unit test, you're going to have a performance essay at the end. It's essentially the same question, but it's going to be specific to this new piece. And so in order to do well, you need to be able to apply the elements that we've talked about through the entire unit, the similarities in the different pieces, and of course the literary tools that may apply in discussing this supplemental work. All right, as always, we have some timelines as we go through. I won't belabor this timeline, but again, as always, up above the timeline, you have literary events. In other words, what are some things that people are writing and publishing? And down below, you have your historical events. And we're going to be reading literature as we go. But if we just take a look here, we're starting back at 1750, as I said, and we're going to move through all the way to 1800. As far as some of the things going on, we've got an Iron Act. This is a tax that wasn't very popular in America because it forbade the colonists from producing their own iron. We had iron ore, we had charcoal, and we could have done that, but Britain wanted the colonists to be buying the iron from them. Benjamin Franklin comes along with some of his experiments in electricity and things, not terribly important to the Revolution, except that they make Benjamin Franklin world famous, and that's going to make him a very powerful diplomat later on. The Liberty Bell was cast, although it wasn't cast to be a Liberty Bell. It got that moniker later on when it was rung at the reading of the Declaration of Independence. And then in America, you have this thing in 1754 beginning, which we call the French and Indian War. The British are going to call this the 7 Years' War, and it's a war that's going on between Britain and France in Europe, but in the Americas, it's going to be between the French who are up in Canada and the British colonists farther below. This is going to be important to the American Revolution because Britain is going to rack up a lot of debt by protecting the American colonists. And some of the taxes that come on later are really to pay back that debt, sort of a protection fee. And whether or not the taxes were fair is something that's still being debated today. All right, keep going on to the next slide here. You're going to see some names that you may not recognize. For instance, 1762, you have this guy by the name of Jean-Jacques Rousseau. He is a Frenchman, never came to America, but he's part of something called the Enlightenment period or the Age of Reason. And it's his philosophy way back in 1762 that he's writing, and we'll talk about later, that is going to influence many of those people in America to take on this big task of revolution. So I said earlier on that revolutions were not something that was happening around the world until some of these great thinkers of the Enlightenment period or the Age of Reason start writing their philosophies and other people start reading them. And the whole perspective towards kings and thrones is going to change quite a lot. All right, so 1763, we have the Treaty of Paris. That's the end of the 7 Years' War. And the French end up giving Canada to Great Britain at that point. That might be important to the American Revolution a little later on. You have some taxes right here that are going to be very unpopular. The Stamp Act. And the Stamp Act is going to come in the wake of the 7 Years' War. It's going to be a tax on every piece of paper that the American colonists must pay. And the money's paying back the debt from the war. So from a British perspective, the idea is we protected you, now you've got to pay for the cost of that protection. To Americans, it was a tax which was put on them, and the great unfairness wasn't so much the excessive nature of a tax, but it was the idea that Parliament in Britain had put that tax on American colonists, and American colonists had no voice in Parliament. So you're going to start hearing that no taxation without representation slogan from this point on as we move along. Thanks to some acts of American patriots, the Stamp Act gets repealed. Benjamin Franklin is actually going to be in favor of the Stamp Act early on, and when it turns many of his fans against him, he's going to become the #1 most vocal agent against the Stamp Act, and he's even going to go to Parliament and argue for its repeal. By 1770, you're going to have the Boston Massacre. Really, it's an unruly group of probably drunk youth in Boston taunting some British soldiers. A shot gets fired, and like so often happens in tense situations, one shot leads to several. And Crispus Attucks, an African-American, is going to be the first to die in the American Revolution. All right, by 1775, the American Revolution is going to be underway. We're going to have the first shots at Lexington and Concord, and the formation of a Continental Army, which is going to be put under George Washington's command. Moving on there. Again, I'm just going with historical events right now because we're going to be reading the literary events later on, and you can always come back and look at these timelines in this video or in the slides. By 1778, France recognizes America as a country, really, really important, as you know, and that's going to bring them into the war on the side of the colonies. And so they're going to be fighting Britain not only in the New World, but they'll be fighting Britain again at sea because they have a large navy, something that the American colonists are still working on building at that time. By 1781, Cornwallis surrenders at the Battle of Yorktown. I can hear my Hamilton fans singing right now. And the Treaty of Paris in 1783 is going to recognize the 13 colonies as a new country, no longer as colonies. The American Revolution is one of the first revolutions of its sort where the common people believe they can actually rise up and throw off a king. One of the things we'll see a little bit later on is this idea that this realization that kings really need a people or they can't be a king, but a people can be a people with or without a king. And so that's an important realization. But you'll notice over here, 1789, the French Revolution begins. And the French had come in on the side of the Americans. They read many of the pamphlets that were being printed about the rights of man. And unfortunately, King Louis XVI, who helped support the American Revolution, ended up facing a revolution of his own people that was probably sparked by the success of the American Revolution. Louis XVI is going to end up being executed by his own people along with his wife, Queen Marie Antoinette. All right, moving along again, 1791, we have the Bill of Rights in the United States. That is in the wake of the United States Constitution in 1789, and the Constitution, as you know, came on the heels of the failed Articles of Confederation. We're not going to get into too much about why that failed. We will touch on it a little bit later on. Meantime, 1793, that French Revolution has turned incredibly bloody, and you have somebody by the name of Robespierre in charge of a very radical group called the Jacobins. And they want not only to see the execution of King Louis XVI and Queen Marie Antoinette, but they want to see the complete eradication, genocide of the upper class of French royalty. We have in the United States something that's going to be important when we get to our Civil War unit later on, something called the Fugitive Slave Act. By 1793, enslaved African Americans in the South had been escaping north, and the North was giving them protection. This act required that anyone in the North who knows of an escaped slave would be required to turn that person in and have that person shipped back into slavery. Fortunately, most people in the North ignored that law completely. And then, of course, we've got our election of our first president with the passing of the Constitution. John Adams becomes the second president, with Jefferson becoming his third. We learn a couple things. They're from different parties, and all they do is fight. And so it's going to be the last time, actually, that the president and the vice president are going to come from different political parties. Now, I don't think that videos work very well inside of other videos. I have a YouTube video here. I'm not going to play that at this time, but I have linked that video for you in Schoology. It's only about 6 minutes long, and from a British perspective, it looks at the origin of the War of Independence, the American Revolution, and I think it's a great compact summary in case you forgot some of the things that you studied in American history back in 9th grade. All right, so some of the things going on in this time period that we're going to pay attention to, population diversity is really kind of an amazing thing here of what's going on with population diversity, in that in a period of about 100 years, the population of the colonies in the United States is going to go from about 60,000 to 3.5 million, probably one of the biggest population growths ever. And one of the interesting things about what's going on in this time is most of the people who are coming here from Europe. Now, originally it was mostly English, right? But as time goes on, we've got people coming from all over Europe. We talked in the last unit about the German population that's going to come over here. And most of the people coming to the United States from Europe half of them actually are under the age of 21. And so you've got a very youthful population here as well. We've got New England is still largely kind of governed by Puritans, but Pennsylvania, which was founded, as you guys know, by William Penn and Quakers, has become sort of the center of progressive thinking in the Americas. Quakers were very forward-thinking about religion. They gave women a voice in religion. They were very forward-thinking about other religions, and they tolerated religions different from their own. They were some of the first people to speak out against slavery and as a group become abolitionists. They believed that the Native Americans could be equals working alongside of them. In the South, one of the things that was changing was there was this Scottish economist named Adam Smith. Sometimes he's called the father of American capitalism, even though he was Scottish. There is this new belief that it's okay to make a profit. And in the South, that's changing the way people are seeing land. So land used to be something that was seen as it belonged to your family. Now it's seen as sort of a commodity. You can use it to make profit. And so you're starting to see, instead of family farms, you're starting to see large, almost factory farms, where people are either paid to work the farm that they don't know, or they're enslaved to work the farm that they don't own. So that's the capitalistic ethic and how that ties in with slavery and population. Now, as we mentioned, the French and Indian War was very costly to the British, and it's one of the reasons why the British then later on passed this thing called the Stamp Act. And the Stamp Act required that every piece of paper used in the colonies have a tiny little stamp showing that the tax had been paid on that. It was probably a fair tax in that there were costs. Americans benefited from that, and now they didn't want to pay for it. But there's also that other side of, if they're going to be taxed, they ought to have some representation in their own government, representation in Parliament. We mentioned the Boston Massacre, and then the Boston Tea Party comes a little bit later. That's a new tax placed on tea and other goods. It wasn't just tea, but the British had placed tax on American goods, and you know that when the Sons of Liberty dressed up, very badly dressed up as Native Americans, climbed aboard some British ships in the harbor, threw the tea overboard, and the king responds, Parliament responds really at the end of that, by passing something called the Intolerable Acts. And the Intolerable Acts severely restricted the rights of the people in the Massachusetts area. And they were already on the verge of rebellion, so to take away their rights just kind of pushed them over the edge. It's around this time that the Continental Congress meets in Philadelphia for the first time, and by the second meeting of the Continental Congress, they formed a Continental Army under the leadership of George Washington. The Battle of Bunker Hill happens in Boston. That's the famous "don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes" battle. And this is really important because it's after this Battle of Bunker Hill when the Patriots on the Hill are actually able to repulse the British that King George III finally declares that the Americans are in a state of rebellion. So we've had other shots and squabbles, but the king was trying to just treat these as insurgencies at this point. Once he declares that the colonies are in rebellion, he is going to send his army full force. And of course, the Declaration of Independence in 1776, we're actually going to be reading that as part of this unit. Many people know about it. Very few people have actually ever read it word for word and studied what it does. It's an amazing document, carefully crafted in many different ways, and very strategic, as you'll see as we go through that. Now, I mentioned this thing called the Age of Reason or the Enlightenment. Some people in Europe might call it Romanticism. But it was a change in the way we're going to think about upper class, middle class, lower class, education, that sort of thing. Some of the names that are going to be really important, we've got Sir Isaac Newton. And Newton, as you guys know, was a scientist. But he started to believe that rules of order, science, and the world existed even socially. And so if you can learn, for instance, that water freezes at 32 degrees and that's always the case, maybe you can find some things out about how society works and identify some natural rules as well. We've got Joseph Addison, who was a great influence on Benjamin Franklin. Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau are going to be really important, involving something called social contract. The idea that human beings can sit down and decide how we want to live together in a society, write out things like constitutions, create our own laws, decide how to enforce them, modify them when they need to be. And I mentioned Adam Smith already, the Scottish economist who's going to sometimes be called the father of American capitalism. And the idea that people can work to make a profit and pay other people and have employees and things like that is going to be very important to the way America grows from the days of its birth. Now, quick kind of review. You know that the first national document that we had in the United States was this thing called the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation basically said that every former colony was sovereign, and they simply were going to work together to form a nation. But the power, the individual power, lay with each of those former colonies, and there was really no central or federal authority at that time. It failed. There was no way to do things like build roads, for instance, through one state to another if one state didn't agree with that kind of thing. And think of it like this. Think of it like the European Union. Every country in Europe has stayed sovereign, but they tried to have this thing called the European Union where they would all work together. The problem was they didn't always work together, and in the past few years we've seen some countries leaving the European Union. So the United States Constitution replaced that, and the Constitution really focused on creating a balance between states' rights and federal rights. Not perfectly. We still argue about that today. It was the primary cause of our Civil War, this idea of what the federal government could decide and what the states could decide. And when the issue of slavery came into this and some states were deciding one thing and the federal government was deciding another, it looked like the federal government was trying to override the individual states' rights. So you'll often hear that, states' rights rallying cry. Another thing that's going to happen during this time period, thanks to folks like Benjamin Franklin, who became really the world's first publishing magnate, lots of pamphlets and newspapers throughout the colonies. People are reading, ideas are spreading, and when a populace is literate and they can read and they can understand, they start talking about what they're reading about. And so a lot of changes in the philosophy are going to happen because this new philosophy is being shared in print. All right, so what you should do is go through these check for understanding questions. These are the kinds of things just to see if you've gotten the most important information from this presentation. We'll do them quickly together. You can add them to your notes later on if you like. So here's the first one. The Quakers advocated all of the following except tolerance of religious diversity, allowing women a voice in religious affairs, remaining a part of England, or abolishing slavery. And that's correct. The Quakers came here to get away from England, but all of those others, they absolutely did. According to the capitalistic ethic, individual people should have the means to do what? This is that Adam Smith guy I was mentioning, and they should have the power to make a profit. So this is a new kind of philosophy. Seems so normal to us today. Number 3, the British Parliament reacted to the Boston Tea Party by passing the Intolerable Acts. Which one of these best described what the Intolerable Acts did? Required each household to allow a British soldier to live with them, required each household to surrender its guns, restricted the self-government of the people of Massachusetts, or increased the taxes on goods shipped from England. And the correct answer on that one is it restricted the rights of the people in Massachusetts to govern themselves. The A up there had happened before. That was the Quartering Act, and that had been in place about 20 years before. Thinkers of the European Enlightenment, they would agree with all of these statements except which one would they disagree with? People have certain natural rights which can't be turned over to a king. People can use reason to understand society and politics. People who underwent a religious awakening make the best leaders. Or D, people should rebel against governments that become too oppressive. So they would agree with all of them except C. And that was an idea from our last unit in New England, the religious awakening. But the reality is The role of a god in determining what happens on Earth is going to be minimized quite a lot during this time period. Most of the people who are going to lead the American Revolution, while many of them may have gone to church and even a certain faith, most of them describe themselves as what we call deists. Their philosophy was they believe there is a God, but that God is not involved in everyday activities, and that human beings have been given a certain intellect and a certain power by that God to make the world a better place. In 1777, Congress adopted the Articles of Confederation, and I'm just going to give you that one because we just talked about it. Created a weak national government. Most of the power was left up to individual states, and so whenever the individual states squabbled, nothing got done. Who helped negotiate the end of the Revolutionary War? Now, I'm not sure we spoke about this one specifically, but our best negotiator is going to be Benjamin Franklin. He is famous worldwide by this point, and he's a very fair man in the way he approaches things. He was never someone who was like, never compromise. In fact, he was always about intelligent compromise. And that's something I think we should try to bring back from time to time. As a capitalistic ethic gradually replaced the Puritan ethic in the colonies, more people began to want to make money. And making money seems to be at the core of everything American ever since then. One of the primary issues that united colonists from all over North America against King George was those taxes. People hated taxes then. They hate taxes now. There was the cry, no taxation without representation. Had they had more representation, they might have had a voice in limiting the taxes or deciding how the taxes would be, the money, the revenue would be spent. What historical event occurred right after the Battle of Bunker Hill? And that would be C. King George declared the colonies officially in rebellion, and that gave him the ability to bring the full force of war against these colonies. The writers of the Bill of Rights. Now, the Bill of Rights was the first 10 amendments to our Constitution. They would agree with Jean-Jacques Rousseau. We talked briefly about Rousseau as this guy who believes in social contract, the idea that we can sit down together and decide what laws we want and how we will enforce them. So which one of these sounds like a Jean-Jacques Rousseau idea? Yeah, that's B. That's governments are formed as social contracts. Rousseau even, he went as far as to say even when you have a king, the king is only on the throne by the blessing of the people, because the people always outnumber the king. And it goes back to that idea, as I said, of a king can't be a king without a people, but a people can be a people without a king. All right, so that's everything we have there. So we're going to get started on this unit, and there may be a check quiz for you in Schoology. You should do really well if you just paid attention to those questions. And then we'll get started in a day with our first piece from this unit. We'll take a look at Benjamin Franklin and an excerpt from one of the first ever autobiographies. He called it The Autobiography of Benjamin Franklin. Actually, I don't even know what he called it because it was published after his death. And the title was probably slapped on there later. But we'll talk about all of that when we get there. All right, thanks for staying with me to the end. I hope you're going to enjoy this unit, and I'll see you in class soon.